At the end of last year's UN climate conference, President of the summit, Alok Sharma, made an emotional apology for a last-minute deal watering down commitments on ending coal production.
I apologise for the way this process has unfolded, and I'm deeply sorry. I also understand the deep disappointment. But I think, as you have noted, it's also vital that we protect this package.
Since that summit, progress on cutting emissions has stalled, even while fire, flood and heat waves ravage. And the failure to take bolder action on coal threatens plans to limit Earth's warming to 1.5 degrees. UK Tory Minister Alok Sharma holds the presidency of the UN climate conference until the next meeting in November. He's in Australia to talk to the new government about its climate ambitions and to ensure climate remains at the centre of political debate. Alok Sharma, welcome to 7:30.
Thank you so much, Sarah.
Now, in the face of the heatwave in the UK and across Europe, the UN Secretary-General says that there must be collective action or we face collective suicide. Is that an exaggeration?
Look, I think we're in a climate emergency, and what we agreed at COP26 in Glasgow was historic. We got almost 200 countries to agree to look again at their emissions reduction targets, show more ambition, and I said at the time that at this stage, we need to ensure that we're delivering and implementing the commitments that we've made, and that's what this past year for me has been all about, going around to different countries, different governments, and ensuring that they act.
But bearing in mind those scenes that you saw in the UK and that we've been watching on our television screens from across Europe, the Australian government is committing to a 43% emissions target. Is that high enough to meet the obligation that we've been asked for collective action?
Look, it's a good start, and it's a lot more than it was previously. But of course, what we need to see is more ambition from all governments. And I think it's important that the government locks in that 43%, and I know that's what they want to do through legislation. But what we all agreed in Glasgow is to look again at our 2030 emissions reduction targets and align them with the Paris temperature goals. And that is about trying to get and limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. That's what we need every country to do.
Yes, and recently you said that the window for that is closing fast.
The window is closing fast, and the science tells us that. And if you're someone who's sceptical about the science, just look around you. As you've said, we're seeing wildfires across Europe. I've just come from the UK. We're experiencing extreme heat for the first time over 40 degrees. We've got wildfires there as well. And you're seeing it here in Australia. I went in Sydney to talk to some of the first responders, and hearing those first-hand accounts of having to deal with bushfires, having to deal with flooding.
Yes, and that's the situation that the new government confronts now. But we just saw a quote from you from the last UN climate conference. It was an unusual moment. It was an emotional moment, notwithstanding the work of the conference. You made an emotional apology for the weakening of a commitment on winding down coal production. Can the world really afford Australia to open new coal mines? Well,
actually, what I was apologising for was that in the last few hours, the process looked a little opaque to some people. But look,
forgive me, it wasn't just the process though, was it? Because you were hoping for a better outcome, stronger language on coal, and you didn't get it.
I was, but it was the first time in 26 conferences that we had any language on coal. And I just make this point, which is that I think very many people understand that the long-term future does not lie in fossil fuels. This is about a transition, a managed transition to move away. And one of the things that we are seeing is a lot of countries committing to go faster when it comes to renewables. So here in Australia, as I understand, there's a target of reaching 82% renewables by 2030 in your electricity in your power sector. That's great. We need to see even more ambition going forward.
But at the same time, we're not ruling out the possibility of new coal production in Australia. To come back to that question, can the world afford for Australia to add more coal into the global environment?
Look, we all need to work together to ensure that if we are able to build out clean energy, if we're able to build out renewables, then actually there is going to be a reduction in the use of fossil fuels by that very effect. But the other thing that I think when people look to invest in new fossil fuels is to ask themselves whether in a few years from now, they might actually end up with stranded assets. They may end up with a project which is not making money, and that is a consideration that every investor needs to take into account. I can tell you, traveling around Southeast Asia, there are countries which cannot get investment in coal, in new coal, and that's why they're also pushing out on renewables.
You also said recently that Australia was talking about its desire to host a climate conference, that required leadership. Does leadership also require action on that question as to whether or not we should be adding new fossil fuels, that is gas as well as coal?
Well, leadership requires ambition on all fronts when it comes to climate action. So whether that's your own emission reduction targets, whether it's the transition to clean energy, whether it's actually supporting developing economies to transition their economies as well. The one thing I can tell you is that if you end up with a COP presidency, the international focus is very much on you, and people will look to you to be even more ambitious, because they will ask that question that, if you want me to show ambition, what ambition are you going to show?
And so what does that mean in relation to the idea of new gas projects? It's still being talked about as a transitional fuel around the world. Australia has more gas projects coming down the line.
Yeah, so look, I think, if we look at what is happening in Europe, for instance, indeed across the world, as a result of Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine, you are seeing countries, to meet their immediate energy needs, do more fossil. The argument that I'm making, though, is that what this should allow you to do is to have the space to accelerate renewables. And you are seeing that.
The UN agency was pretty clear last year, saying that there was no argument for new fossil fuel production. Were they wrong about that? Are you saying there's still room?
No, what I'm saying is that every country starts from a different energy mix. And as a government, you need to make sure you're keeping the lights on, you're keeping the factories running. But if you're going to accelerate renewables, which very many countries are going to do, that by its very nature is going to ensure that you're going to do less fossil fuels. And I just make this point, is that this transition, this clean energy transition, this race to net zero, is about an economic dividend as well as an environmental dividend. So this is about jobs and growth of the future as well.
Let's talk about the political situation that you've arrived into in Australia. I think you're also meeting with the so-called Teal independents while here. How significant are they as a new voice in Australian politics? What are you hoping to see from them?
Well, I actually met with some of them today, and I think it's really interesting, because what it also shows is that this is an issue that has real saliency here in Australia, but actually across the world as well. And one of the discussion points that I have with my Conservative colleagues back in the UK is to point out that yes, there is an environmental dividend, an economic dividend, but there's also an electoral dividend to be had by pursuing this policy. We've got a Prime Minister right now, Boris Johnson, who's been championing green growth. What I want to ensure that the next Prime Minister we have in the United Kingdom does exactly the same.
Come back to Boris in one moment. Are you meeting Peter Dutton as well while you're here?
Yes, I met Peter Dutton earlier this afternoon, and we had a discussion.
What did you talk about?
Well, I talked about what we are doing in the UK, why there is a consensus on this issue in the United Kingdom, and it is very much about saying that this is about generating jobs, this is about generating economic growth.
Were you disappointed to hear him say that they wouldn't back the government's 43% target? It's not, as you have said, it's not enough to close the window on warming at 1.5 degrees. Are you disappointed that the opposition has made that call?
I don't want to sort of start commenting on domestic politics in another country, but all I say to you is that the argument that I'm making in the UK, the reason we need to stay strong on this issue, because as I said, this also has an electoral dividend at the end of the day.
You mentioned Boris Johnson's leadership in climate, and for many years the British Conservative Party has been a global leader in climate change. What happens if, under, let's say, Liz Truss, looking the most likely candidate to replace Boris Johnson, it's not decided yet, but if she starts tinkering with the targets, what does that mean? Look,
this is a leadership issue, and about a week ago I made an intervention where I said that I would resign if we ended up with a Prime Minister and a leader who was not going to have this front and centre. Both the two candidates in the race now have been very clear. They support the net zero by 2050 agenda, and they support the short-term targets to get there as well. But of course, this is about leadership. Boris Johnson led this right from the front, and that's what I want to see from the next Prime Minister.
Is that also your message to politicians, both here in Fiji, where you're going next, that this is a matter of principle as well as politics?
This is a matter of survival, quite frankly. So, in Fiji, it's a country, an island that is at the front line of climate change. For them, this is literally having a place to call home, and that's why it's important we act on this issue. And I just make one final point here, Sarah, which is that climate change isn't something that affects other people. It does not recognise borders. It is affecting all of us, and we can see the impacts of it, and that's why we need to act.
Alok Sharma, thank you very much indeed for joining the programme.
Thank you, Sarah.